In the previous approach, our representative islander chose directly how much labor to supply, which made our lives actually quite easy. But of course, without explicit prices or markets, it's hard to call that a general equilibrium model. So let's go ahead and actually introduce prices. The islanders will now have to make two kinds of decisions. First, their consumption decisions are based on market prices for consumption goods, either harvests or other goods. And they will also have to make labor supply decision by choosing in which sector they want to work. And they base their decision on which sector pays the most. So for market prices, let's continue to use the good M as numerator and set its price to 1. The price of food relative to the other good is simply written PT. Now that we have markets, we have a supply side and a demand side. So let's write the supply side. As before, food production is proportional to the stock of resources, S of T, and the labor used to harvest, L of H. We write the supply of harvest as Hs of T, which is the supply of harvest, equals to alpha S of T, LH of T. This harvest will later be bought by consumers, of course. The supply of aggregate other good is produced in the same linear technology as before. So we write MS for supply equals to the labor force in that sector, LM of T. So that was the output of the industries. Of course, each sector requires islanders to work as labor input and has to pay them a certain wage. Let's assume that there's perfect competition. It was already invented by ancient Polynesian. This just essentially means that firms which choose how many workers to employ take as given anything else. So they take as given prices, a wage rate, as well as the current stock of resources available. Let's start with the harvesting sector. We assume that we have a single firm that employs all the labor in the harvest sector, but somehow, as we said, it's perfect competition, so prices are taken as given. The profit of the firm are, as usual, revenues minus production costs. So we write them as follows. So pi of H, which is a function of the total labor use, L of H at time t, is equal to the sales price PT multiplied by the total production, the harvest, HS of T. This represents the revenue of the firm minus the cost of the firm, which will be the wage rate, WH of T, multiplied by how many laborers are employed, LH of T. Of course, harvest is in fact a function of how many workers work in that firm, so we can't leave this that way. Let's already substitute HS of T, and we get this profit function, so which is equal to PT that multiplies alpha ST LHT, how much is produced by a certain number of LHT of workers, minus wages WHT multiplied by LHT. So we see that profits are actually linear in L. So this means that we can't technically optimize that function and find the optimal labor force employed by the firm LH of T. But we can guess that since this is perfect competition, so profits cannot be infinite or they cannot be negative, so we'll get the usual result that they are in fact zero. So let's just write this, that profits are equal to 0. And we can divide this condition directly by LHT to get rid of it and isolate directly the wage WH of t. This simply gives us that the wage rate is WH of t equals to PT alpha S of t. So we see that essentially farmers are paid exactly the productivity of labor. The farmer's wage will increase if the price of food go up, or if they produce more, which happens if either alpha or S of t goes up. Now a similar argument can be made for the other sector. The compensation of islanders who choose to work in that sector is simply their productivity. And we must remember that the sales price in the other sector is 1, so we can infer that the wage rate will simply be, so we write it as Wm of t equals to the total value produced, which is Ms of t multiplied by 1, the price, which is divided by the total number of labor in that sector, Lm of t. And of course, we have this linear production function, so we can just substitute Ms of t with its production, Lm of t, and find that the wage rate will simply be equal to 1. Islanders live for 1 unit of time and they supply 1 unit of labor. We don't have a representative islander anymore. We now define functions for each islander. Of course, they're all identical. The preferences for food and other goods are now defined in terms of individual consumption. Since they are on the demand side of the market, we will note them with the letter D. So they are U, so small u of HDT, MDT, where of course HDT is the individual demand for harvests and MDT is the individual demand for the aggregate of other goods that are the same comme Douglas as before, HDT to the beta, MDT to the 1 minus beta. I know this is complicated to have exponents beta and then these as demand. But that's the best I could do, so don't confuse them. D is not an exponent, it's just it just indicates that they are the demanded quantities. Islander workers have a single decision to take. In which sector do they work? So if we did model the labor market, we would model as well their labor supply, like how long do they want to work. Here, that the only thing they care about is how much they are paid in each sector. So of course, in real life, some people would prefer to be artists and have carved statues. Some other would prefer to work in the field as farmer. Here they are really materialistic. So there's only one possible solution for this market, is that both wage rate have to be the same. Otherwise, of course, all the workers would rush to the sector that pays more, and then over time the productivity of the workers in that sector would go down because it would be an oversupply of workers. So then the wage rate would go back down to the same as the other one. So by arbitrage, we can simply write that the equilibrium on the labor market yields that the wage rate in the harvest sector, WHT, is equal to the wage rate in the other sector, WMT, and we just write that it's equal to this unique wage rate, WT. Note, by the way, that we already know that MT equals 1 from earlier, so we already that, in fact, we know that WT will be 1 and WHT will also be 1. But let's now leave this way, so we can describe it later when we describe the whole equilibrium of the economy. Individual islanders have a budget constraint different from the representative islander. Before, the constraint was in terms of labor supply, so the representative islander could supply some labor to one sector, some labor to the other sector. Here, it's in terms of the income that they get by working. and the wage rate. And so what they have to choose then is how much to spend on each, so either on harvests or on other good. So it looks like a typical consumer choice model. Like all utility maximizing agents, we assume that Polynesians are rational and they like consumption. So they don't they don't keep any money unspent. We can just already know that they spend the whole income on consumption. So we can simply express the constraint as income equals expense. So the income is the wage rate that is the same for any sector, WT, times 1 because they work 1 unit. And this equals to either expense on harvest, which is PT, the price of harvest, multiplied by HD, the demand for harvest, plus MD, the demand for other good. Of course, this would be multiplied by 1, the price of other good. Even though the budget constraint look different from the representative islander, we will be able to use it to substitute directly MDT in the utility function to get a simpler maximization. So we get simply that MDT will be equal to WT minus PT HDT. Let's continue describing the Easter Island market. We were just about to write the Islander's maximization problem. So as a reminder, the utility of the Islander is UT equals to HDT to the beta, so that's the harvest demanded, multiplied by MDT to the 1 minus beta, the other good demanded. And we directly substitute MDT to write it in terms of the demand for harvest only. And we get UT equals to HDT to the beta and W multiplied by WT minus PT HDT to the 1 minus beta. So with this, it's very easy to write the maximization problem, which is the maximization by choosing the demand for harvest, HDT, of this utility function with respect to HDT. The first order conditions look like they were before. So if we differentiate our utility with respect to the first HDT to the beta, so we get beta HDT to the beta minus 1, which multiplies the parenthesis to the 1 minus beta. And if we differentiate with respect to the second HDT inside the parenthesis, we get HDT to the beta multiplied by 1 minus beta times the parenthesis WT minus PT HDT to the minus beta. And then we differentiate with HDT inside the parenthesis, so we get that this is multiplied by minus PT. And of course, for a maximum, this has to be equal to 0. And again, I'm going to spare you the detail of the computation, but just trust me in knowing that this simplifies to HDT equals to beta, so the preference for food, which multiplies WT divided by PT. So this means that islanders buy more food if they prefer more food more, if they have a higher purchasing power, WT, and if the price of food relative to the other good is lower. So that makes sense. So this condition is for a single islander. Of course, they are all the same. So to recover our harvesting for the whole island, we should aggregate them to get back to the level of the whole island. To do that, we have to know what is the population of the island. So I didn't define it explicitly, but it's possible to get one value by going through the labor market. So since individuals live for 1 unit of time and they supply 1 unit of labor, so they all work exactly the same and they don't choose how much work they provide, it's just 1 unit, then the total population is exactly equal to the total labor supplied, so the total labor available, which is simply LT. So we can just multiply LT on each side, and we get LT multiplied by HDT equals to beta multiplied by WT LT divided by PT. And as we already said, all islanders are the same. So it means that the harvest consumed by all islanders is simply the total harvest consumed on the island. So it's going to be capital HDT, which equals to the same amount as before. So that's it. We're almost done. The last step will be to describe the total equilibrium on the island. Let's now get a bit more formal to illustrate an important concept in economics. We define an economic equilibrium as a set of quantities and prices such that all agents behave optimally given the market prices, and in which all markets clear. So this means two things. So first of all, the demand decisions of consumers make sense given market prices and their preferences. And of course, the supply choices of firms make sense given the market prices of their products and the price of their inputs and their technology. And then secondly, that market clear, that means there is no excess supply or excess demand in any market. Everything that is produced is consumed, and consumers wouldn't have wanted more if firms had given them more at the same price. So in the context of our model, we have two equilibrium conditions and four optimality conditions. So the equilibrium conditions are as follow. So the equilibrium on the labor market means that the total labor force supplied by the islanders equal to the total labor force demanded by each sector. So this means essentially that LHT, the labor force in the harvest sector, plus LMT, the labor force demanded by the other goods sector, is equal to the total labor of the island. So this is just L of T. Secondly, the equilibrium on the food market means that harvest supplied by the market equals the one demanded by the islanders. So simply that HS of T equals HD of T. So we just write that it equals to the harvest being exchanged on the island at H of T. You may ask yourselves, why don't we add the equilibrium condition of the other good market? That's simply because islanders have to respect their budget constraint. And if the demand is at equilibrium in the harvesting sector, then it is automatically going to be at equilibrium in the other sector as well. This is called Walras's law. But of course, we could write it down if we wanted. Now let's go with the four optimality condition. So the optimal consumption choices means that simply the harvest demand HTT equals to here beta multiplied by WT divided by PT. So preferences for harvest and the relative price of harvests. The optimal choice of sector by workers implies a single wage rate. So the wage rate in the harvest sector is equal to the wage rate in the other goods market, and it's just equal to the wage rate and then WT, the unified wage rate. Finally, we have two optimality conditions on the supply side, or we could say on firm decisions, but we were a bit vague with the concept of firms. They don't play that much of a role. So basically, wages must reflect workers' productivity. So because input choices are optimal. So the optimal input choice in the food sector is a function of the harvesting technology. So we write that so the wage rate WH of T has to equal to alpha PTST. So what the value that is produced by a farmer in the harvesting sector. And finally, the optimal input choice in the other sector is also a reflection of its technology. So here it's simply that WMT equals 1. So these are our 6 conditions. We use them to recover our harvesting function. So let's start with condition number 3, the demand on the harvest sector. HD equals to beta WT LT divided by PT. So first of all, we have established that we have equilibrium in the harvesting sector, so that HDT is just HT, so the harvesting on the island. Similarly, in 5, we know that WHT is WT thanks to 4. So let's use that to substitute WT in our harvesting function. So we get that HT equals to beta alpha PT ST LT divided by PT. And of course, what we can do is simplify the price on the numerator and denominator. And we simply get our harvesting function, HT equals to alpha beta LT ST. So after much sweat, we recover the same harvesting function. In fact, the utility function of each islander and their technology is the same as that of the representative islander. Then the first fundamental theorem of welfare economics actually predicted that this Pareto efficient allocation of resources between harvests and other goods would be the same for the representative islander as the one generated by free market. Note that we say efficient allocation. Is that efficient? Well, we just saw that free exploitation of a renewable resource is actually not efficient. So what give? What's the difference here? Think about it for a while. So the difference is that here we purposefully just neglected the impact of harvest on the stock of resources. So we just said that they choose HT, taking ST as given. So we have essentially assumed that islanders are myopic and that they don't realize that they shouldn't maximize just their day-to-day consumption or their day-to-day utility. But in fact, they should choose harvesting today, considering their utility today and tomorrow and the day after. So they could discount the future maybe, but they should take it into account. So is it possible that they were as myopic as described here and as described by Jared Diamond, essentially in his story, and only think about the present? Well, so remember the work of Elinor Ostrom. We briefly alluded to it. You remember what she found? I'm giving you some time to recollect your memories. Yes, she found that small communities around the world could sometimes successfully administer common resources in a sustainable way. So they're not myopic, they're not stupid. So since Easter Island to me looks like a small world, a tiny world in fact, so it looks surprising that the Polynesians wouldn't have managed to administer it well. But now that's digressing a bit, so let's just for now finish to describe the model. So we now describe explicitly how harvest, HT, will impact the stock of resources, ST.